In the heart of a city teeming with noise and chaos, the haunting strains of a violin cut through the crowd, played by Malachi Rivers, a blind musician whose talent is as undeniable as his resilience. But when a powerful businessman accuses him of being a fraud in a viral moment of humiliation, the clash of two lives ignites a storm of secrets and prejudice. Journalist Eva Carter sees more than a scandal, she sees a story that could change hearts. As she digs deeper, the threads of Malachi's past and Richard Hale's pain weave into an intricate tapestry of generational prejudice and personal loss. Each revelation draws them closer to a truth that will test the limits of forgiveness. What begins as a public act of cruelty spirals into an extraordinary journey of redemption, culminating in a performance that will challenge a fractured community to see beyond appearances. In shadows of perception, even in the darkest corners of humanity, light finds a way to break through. Will Malachi's music mend what prejudice has torn apart, or will the shadows of the past keep them divided forever? The sharp clatter of subway turnstiles and the hum of countless conversations filled the underground station. Amid the chaos, Malachi Rivers stood with his violin, the bow poised delicately in his hand. His sightless eyes stared straight ahead, but his world was vivid, painted with the colors of sound. The first note pierced the air, silencing the rush of commuters. A haunting melody emerged, weaving through the dimly lit space, drawing curious onlookers closer. Shoes shuffled against the tiled floor as a small crowd formed around him. Eva Carter lingered at the edge of the gathering, her journalist instincts piqued. The young woman, carrying a notebook and camera, couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene. "He's incredible," she muttered to herself, scribbling quick notes. As Malachi's fingers danced on the strings, his music told stories words never could. Applause erupted as he ended the piece, and he smiled faintly. For a brief moment, the world seemed kind. The applause faded too quickly, replaced by the harsh bark of a man's voice. "This is a scam." The crowd parted, revealing Richard Hale, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the grime of the station. His face twisted in disdain as he gestured toward Malachi. "You expect me to believe this?" Richard sneered, stepping closer. "A blind violinist? This is a setup to milk sympathy out of gullible people." Malachi froze, gripping his violin tightly. The warmth of the applause was replaced by the cold weight of shame. "Sir, you don't know what you're talking about," Malachi said calmly, though his voice trembled. "I know a con artist when I see one," Richard shot back. "Why don't you drop the act and admit it?" The crowd murmured uneasily. Some stepped back, unwilling to get involved, while others pulled out their phones, recording the spectacle. Eva pushed her way forward. "Hey, back off. You have no idea who he is." Richard's eyes flicked toward her, unimpressed. "And who are you? His accomplice?" "No," Eva snapped, her hazel eyes blazing. "But I know talent and integrity when I see it. Maybe you should try it sometime." Richard snorted and walked away, leaving behind a scattered crowd and a humiliated Malachi. The soft hum of Malachi's kettle was the only sound in his small apartment that night. He sat at his kitchen table, his violin resting in its case nearby. The incident replayed in his mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. His father's voice seemed to echo from the past. "Never let them take your dignity, Malachi. It's yours, no matter what they say." A knock at the door startled him. He opened it cautiously, recognizing the soft voice of the woman from earlier. "It's Eva," she said. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Malachi hesitated but stepped aside. "Why? You don't even know me." "I don't need to," Eva replied, setting her camera bag on a chair. "I saw what happened, and it wasn't right. You deserve better." Her sincerity disarmed him. They sat and talked, about the subway, his music, her work. For the first time since the incident, Malachi felt a glimmer of hope. The following day, Eva and Malachi met at a small cafe near his neighborhood. The warm smell of coffee and fresh pastries provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "You're amazing," Eva said, stirring her cappuccino. Your music, it's more than just notes. It's a story. People need to hear it. Malachi shrugged, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee mug. People hear it. They just don't listen. Yesterday proved that. Yesterday was one man, Eva countered. One loud, wrong man. Let me help you. Let me tell your story. Malachi frowned. I'm not sure I want the attention. It's not about attention, Eva said, leaning forward. It's about showing people who you are. Your resilience, your talent, your truth. Malachi considered her words. I'll think about it. Richard Hale sat in his high-rise office, the city skyline sprawled out before him. His assistant had just left, dropping off a thick folder of reports. On his computer screen, the subway confrontation played on repeat. The video, now viral, was drawing harsh criticism. Comments flooded the screen, calling him a bully, a racist, a privileged tyrant. This is ridiculous, Richard muttered, slamming his fist on the desk. Ridiculous or not, it's damaging, said his colleague, standing by the window. You need to address this, Richard. Publicly. Richard waved him off. I don't owe anyone an explanation. But as the screen flickered to another video, a news clip about his brother's death in custody years ago, his steely exterior cracked. He closed the browser, staring blankly at his reflection in the glass. It's all their fault, he thought. Their lies. Their games. Malachi sat on his worn couch, running his fingers across the ridges of his violin. The faint hum of distant traffic filled the room, but his mind wandered back to a different sound, his father's voice. You hear that, Malachi? His father's deep baritone was warm, carrying over the soft plucks of violin strings. Just notes, Dad, a much younger Malachi replied, his small hands fumbling with the bow. Not just notes, son, his father said, crouching beside him. That's how we fight. How we heal. Music is your power. Use it wisely. His father's encouragement had been a shield against the harshness of the world. Even after losing his father years ago, Malachi carried his lessons, weaving them into his melodies. The present pulled him back sharply as Eva's knock echoed through the apartment. Come in, he called, setting the violin aside. Eva stepped in, carrying her camera bag and a notepad. Hope I'm not interrupting. No, just thinking, Malachi replied. Eva glanced at the violin. Was it your dad who taught you to play? A small smile crossed Malachi's face. Yeah. He believed music could do what words sometimes couldn't. Guess he was right. Eva's curiosity deepened. Your father seems like he was an incredible man. What did he do? He was a lawyer, Malachi said. Fought for people who didn't have a voice. He taught me to stand tall, even when it felt like the world wanted me to shrink. Eva scribbled a note, her voice soft. Sounds like you inherited more than just his strength. Malachi nodded, the warmth of the memory carrying him forward. Eva sat in her cramped office, her computer screen glowing in the dim light. She had pulled up public records, news articles, and anything she could find about Malachi Rivers and Richard Hale. All right, she muttered, sipping a lukewarm coffee. Let's connect the dots. Her search led her to an old case involving Richard's family, a wrongful imprisonment lawsuit from over a decade ago. The details were sparse, but it mentioned Richard's younger brother, who had died in custody after being arrested for a crime he didn't commit. Eva leaned back, chewing the end of her pen. This is bigger than I thought. Digging further, she discovered something that made her pause. The attorney who had represented the plaintiffs in a separate racial injustice case that same year was one name she recognized immediately, Elijah Rivers, Malachi's father. Eva's breath caught. No way. She quickly jotted down her findings, the pieces of a larger story starting to form. Eva returned to Malachi's apartment the next morning, clutching her notepad. Her knock was softer this time, almost hesitant. Eva, Malachi greeted, opening the door. You're persistent, I'll give you that. Can I come in? She asked. He gestured toward the couch. What's on your mind? She sat, fumbling with her notes. I've been digging into your father's work and Richard's past. There's something you need to know. Malachi tensed. What is it? Your dad, he represented a family in a racial injustice case years ago. That case played a role in bringing down Richard's father's business, she said carefully. I think that's why Why he hates me. Malachi interrupted, his voice sharp. Eva shook her head. It's not that simple. I think his anger comes from losing his brother and blaming your dad for some of the fallout. Malachi exhaled slowly, leaning back. I didn't know. I thought you should, Eva said gently. If this gets out, people are going to dig into everything. You deserve to know the full picture. Malachi nodded, his jaw tight. Thank you for telling me. I need some time to process this. In his sprawling suburban home, Richard sat at the dining table, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Across from him sat his estranged sister, Claire, her arms crossed tightly. You're a real piece of work, you know that? Claire said, breaking the silence. Richard didn't look up. What do you want, Claire? I saw the video, Richard. Everyone saw it, she snapped. You humiliated that man for no reason. Haven't we learned anything? Richard's eyes narrowed. Don't lecture me. You weren't there. You don't know. I know you're still bitter about James, Claire interrupted, her voice softening. But what does attacking strangers solve? James wouldn't have wanted this. Richard slammed the glass down. Don't talk about what James would have wanted. He's gone because of people like them. No, Claire said firmly. He's gone because of a broken system. Blaming everyone else won't bring him back. Richard's shoulders sagged, his anger replaced by a weariness he couldn't shake. Maybe you should look at yourself for once, Claire said, standing. And figure out who you're really mad at. The comments section under the viral video of Richard's confrontation with Malachi was a battleground. Typical rich guy behavior. Malachi Rivers is a fraud. Can we just stop and talk about the real issue here, systemic racism? Eva scrolled through the chaos, biting her lip. Public opinion was split, and Malachi's name was becoming a lightning rod for debate. She picked up her phone and dialed her editor. I want to pitch a bigger story about Malachi Rivers. It's not just about the subway incident. There's a bigger narrative here about resilience, justice, and systemic prejudice. Her editor's voice was cautious. You've got something concrete to work with? I do, Eva said firmly. This is a story worth telling. All right, the editor said. Let's see what you can do. Eva hung up, determination filling her. But as she looked at the screen again, one comment stood out. Who is Malachi Rivers, really? Eva sat across from her editor in the cramped office of a local newsroom. Papers cluttered the desk between them, but her focus was entirely on the pitch she'd been preparing all night. This isn't just about Malachi, Eva began, her voice steady. It's about what he represents, resilience, injustice, and the power of art to heal. People need this story. Her editor, a grizzled man in his 50s, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. All right, but is there enough substance here? It can't just be a sympathy piece. There's plenty of substance, Eva countered. His father was a civil rights attorney who took on cases that reshaped lives. And then there's the viral video. It sparked conversations about systemic prejudice and personal accountability. The editor raised an eyebrow. What about Richard Hale? Eva hesitated. That's where it gets complicated. I think there's more to him than the public sees, and I want to dig deeper. His family's history is tied to Malachi's in unexpected ways. The editor stroked his chin, mulling it over. If Malachi agrees to go on record, I'll greenlight it. But you'd better make this worth our time, Eva. I will, she promised, already planning her next steps. Malachi stood in the park near his apartment, his violin case resting by a bench. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint chatter of joggers and the rustling of leaves. He played softly, losing himself in the melody, until Eva's voice broke through. "Malachi." He stopped and turned his head toward her. "Eva. You always seem to find me." She grinned as she approached. "What can I say? I'm persistent." Malachi chuckled. "What's on your mind?" She sat beside him. "The story. I pitched it to my editor, and they're interested. But it won't work without you." Malachi sighed, setting his violin down. "I don't know, Eva. I'm not sure I'm ready for all this attention." "You don't have to be," she said softly. "But your story can inspire people. You said your father taught you to stand tall. This is your chance to do that." Malachi was silent for a moment, his fingers brushing the strings of his violin. "What if they don't listen? What if it changes nothing?" "Then you'll have tried," Eva replied. "And maybe you'll reach one person who needed to hear it. Isn't that enough?" Malachi nodded slowly. "All right. I'll do it. But I want it to be about the music too, not just the struggle." Eva smiled. "Deal." Richard sat in his office late that night, staring at the empty screen of his computer. The blinds were drawn, and a half-empty bottle of scotch sat on his desk. The viral video still haunted him, the comments digging under his skin. A knock on the door startled him. "What now?" he muttered. His assistant, a young woman with a nervous demeanor, poked her head in. "Mr. Hale, I thought you should see this." She handed him a printout of an article headline, "The Violinist and the CEO, A Tale of Prejudice." Richard's jaw tightened. "Is this about that subway nonsense?" "It's gaining traction," she said carefully. "And they're looking into your family history." Richard's face darkened. "That's enough. Leave." As she closed the door, Richard buried his face in his hands. Memories of his brother James flooded back, his laughter, his dreams of becoming a writer, and the night he was taken away in handcuffs. He poured another glass of scotch and muttered to himself, "This isn't my fault." It never was. But the weight of his own words felt heavier than the silence in the room. Eva's studio was modest but cozy, with a camera set up facing a small armchair. Malachi sat nervously, his hands resting on his lap, while Eva adjusted the lighting. "Relax," she said, smiling. "It's just us." "That's easy for you to say," Malachi replied. "You're not the one putting your life on display." "You're not putting your life on display," Eva corrected, sitting across from him. "You're sharing your truth. There's a difference." He nodded, taking a deep breath. "All right. Let's do it." Eva hit record and asked her first question. "Malachi, can you tell us about your music? What does it mean to you?" "It's everything," Malachi said, his voice soft but steady. "It's how I express what words can't. It's how I connect to the world, even when I can't see it." "And what about your father?" Eva prompted gently. A small smile crossed his face. "My father was my hero. He taught me that music could be a weapon and a shield. He used his voice to fight injustice, and he told me to use mine through my violin." As the interview continued, Malachi opened up about his struggles, his father's legacy, and the subway incident. His words were raw and heartfelt, painting a picture of a man who had endured much but remained unbroken. When they finished, Eva looked at him with admiration. "That was incredible, Malachi. Thank you for trusting me." He gave her a small smile. "Let's hope it makes a difference." Later that evening, Eva sat in her office, reviewing the footage from the interview. Malachi's words echoed in her mind, but it was something else that caught her attention, a detail she hadn't noticed before. She pulled up her research again, cross-referencing dates and cases. The more she read, the clearer it became. Malachi's father had been directly involved in a case that exposed corruption in Richard's father's business. Eva leaned back in her chair, her heart racing. This changes everything. She picked up her phone and dialed Malachi. "I need to tell you something." Can we meet tomorrow? What is it? Malachi asked, his tone cautious. It's about your father and Richard Hale. I think their pasts are more connected than we realized. There was a long pause before Malachi replied, all right. Tomorrow. As Eva hung up, she stared at her notes, the pieces of a larger story coming together. This was no longer just about Malachi's resilience or Richard's prejudice, it was about the generational wounds that tied them together. Malachi paced the length of his living room, the soft creak of floorboards marking his tension. Eva sat at his small kitchen table, her notebook open, filled with hastily scribbled notes. The air between them was thick with the weight of her revelation. So, Malachi said, finally breaking the silence. My father played a part in all of this. Eva nodded, her voice cautious. He exposed corruption in Richard's father's company, which spiraled into financial ruin. That fallout, in turn, set the stage for Richard's brother and his tragic death. Malachi leaned against the wall, running his hand over his face. It's all connected. My father fought for justice, and someone else's family paid the price. Now Richard's lashing out at me. Eva's voice softened. Malachi, this isn't about blame. It's about understanding why Richard is the way he is, and maybe helping him see things differently. He turned to her, a mix of frustration and determination in his expression. You want me to confront him, don't you? I think it's the only way forward, Eva admitted. For both of you. Malachi's lips tightened. The echoes of his father's lessons swirled in his mind. Sometimes, son, confronting pain is the only way to heal it. All right, he said finally. Let's set up the meeting. The glow of city lights seeped through the blinds of Richard Hale's sleek office. He sat behind his desk, absent-mindedly flipping a pen between his fingers. His phone buzzed. Who is it? He barked to his assistant, who hovered nervously at the door. Eva Carter, the journalist covering the subway incident. She says it's urgent. Richard's jaw tightened, but he waved her to transfer the call. This is Richard Hale, he said tersely. Mr. Hale, this is Eva Carter, came her steady voice. I'm calling on behalf of Malachi Rivers. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. What does he want? A meeting, Eva said simply. There's more to your shared history than you realize. He deserves a chance to speak with you, and you might need it more than you think. Richard scoffed. I don't owe him anything. Maybe not, Eva replied, her tone unyielding. But if you really care about your brother's memory, you'll hear him out. This isn't just about the past, Mr. Hale. It's about what you do with it now. Richard hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally, he muttered, fine. Set it up. The cafe was quiet, its patrons murmuring softly over cups of steaming coffee. Eva sat at a corner table, fidgeting with her camera as she glanced at the two men before her. Malachi sat stiffly, his unseeing eyes directed toward Richard. Across from him, Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression guarded. You wanted this meeting, Richard began. So talk. Malachi's voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it. This isn't easy for me, but I'm not here to argue. I just want to understand. Understand what? Richard snapped. How your father ruined my family. Eva flinched, but Malachi remained calm. My father fought for justice, not to hurt anyone. He had no idea the ripple effects his work would have. But I think you've carried that bitterness with you ever since, and now it's blinded you. Richard's lips curled into a bitter smile. Blinded me? That's rich, coming from you. Stop it, Malachi said sharply. You don't know what it's like to live in my world. To fight for dignity every day. And I didn't ask for this connection between us, but it's here. So we can either face it, or you can keep running. Richard's defenses cracked, just for a moment. You think I'm running? I think you're scared, Malachi replied. Scared to admit that the world isn't as black and white as you want it to be. Your brother's death, it wasn't my father's fault. It was the system. The same system that I've fought my whole life, just like he did. Silence fell. Richard stared at the table, his fists clenched. Finally, he stood. I need time to think. Richard sat in his darkened living room, a tumbler of whiskey untouched on the coffee table. Claire's voice echoed in his mind from their last conversation. Maybe you should look at yourself for once. He thought about James, his laughter, his dreams, his senseless death. And then Malachi's words, it was the system. For the first time, Richard allowed himself to question the anger he had carried for years. It wasn't justice, it was a shield. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let it go. The room buzzed with anticipation as the community gathered for a special event. At the front of the hall, Malachi stood with his violin, Eva by his side, adjusting her camera. Richard entered quietly, unnoticed at first. He took a seat near the back, watching as Malachi began to play. The music was hauntingly beautiful, weaving together sorrow and hope. When the performance ended, Malachi spoke into the microphone. This piece is about the things we carry, the pain, the anger, the hope. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we can find light if we're willing to look for it. The audience erupted in applause. Richard sat frozen for a moment before slowly rising to his feet. He made his way to Malachi, the crowd parting to let him through. When he reached the stage, he extended a hand. Malachi. I'm sorry. Malachi hesitated, then took it. So am I. The room fell silent as the two men shared a quiet moment of understanding. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. The community center hummed with activity. Volunteers bustled about, setting up chairs, stringing lights, and hanging banners for the evening's event. Malachi sat at a table with Eva, his fingers tracing the edge of a flyer. You really think people will come? He asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Eva glanced up from her notebook, her hazel eyes resolute. They'll come. This isn't just about your music, Malachi. It's about everything you represent. He frowned. And what's that, exactly? Hope, Eva said simply. Forgiveness. A chance for people to see beyond their own biases. Tonight isn't just for you, it's for everyone. Malachi's lips twitched into a small smile. You're quite the optimist, aren't you? Someone has to be, Eva replied, returning to her notes. After a pause, she added, by the way, Richard said he'd come. Malachi's fingers stilled on the flyer. You're sure that's a good idea? I think it's necessary, Eva said. This is a chance for both of you to move forward. Malachi nodded slowly, his thoughts heavy. Let's hope you're right. Richard stared at the invitation on his desk. The simple words, an evening with Malachi Rivers, a story through music, seemed to mock him. His assistant knocked lightly on the door. Mr. Hale? The car is ready if you're planning to attend. Richard sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. And if I'm not? The assistant hesitated. Then. I'll cancel. The silence stretched until Richard finally stood. No. I'll go. As he slipped on his coat, his thoughts swirled. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to attend. Guilt? Curiosity? A faint hope for something he couldn't yet name? Whatever it was, it pulled him forward. The community center filled quickly, the hum of conversation rising as locals found their seats. The air was electric with anticipation. Eva stood by the stage, checking her camera equipment as Malachi tuned his violin. Packed house, she said with a grin. You nervous? Terrified, Malachi admitted, though his tone was light. But it's not the crowd I'm worried about. Eva followed his gaze to the back of the room, where Richard had just entered. He stood awkwardly near the door, scanning the crowd. You'll be fine, Eva said, squeezing his shoulder. You've got this. Malachi gave a small nod and adjusted his grip on the violin. Let's find out. The lights dimmed, and the chatter quieted. Malachi stepped onto the stage, his violin gleaming under the soft glow. He stood silently for a moment, letting the stillness settle. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady but soft. "Tonight, I want to share a story with you. Not with words, but with music." He raised his bow, and the first haunting notes filled the room. The melody was raw, weaving pain and resilience into every chord. It was a story of loss, struggle, and hope, a reflection of his own journey. Richard watched from the back, his jaw tight. The music stirred something deep within him, something he couldn't quite name. Memories of James flickered in his mind, his laughter, his dreams, the way he'd scribble stories in a worn notebook. As the piece ended, the audience erupted into applause. Malachi smiled faintly, then spoke again. "This next piece is about forgiveness. It's a hard thing to give, and sometimes, even harder to accept." He played again, the notes lighter this time, carrying a sense of release. The crowd listened intently, many wiping away tears. The applause still echoed as Malachi stepped off the stage, his body tense with exhaustion and adrenaline. He barely had time to catch his breath before Richard approached. "That was powerful," Richard said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Malachi turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I almost didn't," Richard admitted. "But I'm glad I did." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Richard said, "I owe you an apology. For everything." Malachi tilted his head. "What made you change your mind?" Richard exhaled slowly. "Your music. It reminded me of James, my brother. He had a dream of becoming a writer, of using his words to make a difference. Your father fought for justice in his way. And tonight, I realized I've been fighting the wrong fight." Malachi steadied him for a moment, then extended a hand. "Maybe it's time to fight together instead." Richard hesitated, then took his hand. "Maybe it is." The night air was cool, the stars bright above the city. Guests lingered outside, discussing the performance. Eva found Malachi sitting on a bench, his violin case at his feet. "Quite the night," she said, sitting beside him. "More than I expected," Malachi admitted. He glanced toward the crowd, where Richard stood speaking with a group of locals. "Do you think he'll change?" "I think he already has," Eva said. "And I think you had something to do with that." Malachi smiled faintly. "It's strange. For so long, I thought my music was just a way to survive. But tonight, it felt like more." "It is more," Eva said. "It's a bridge." Malachi nodded, the weight on his shoulders feeling lighter than it had in years. "Maybe my father was right. Maybe music really can change the world, one person at a time." The morning sun streamed through the curtains of Malachi's apartment. He sat at his small kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming in front of him. Eva leaned against the counter, her notebook open as she scrolled through her phone. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, glancing up at him. Malachi shook his head. "You know I don't bother with that stuff." "Well, you might want to make an exception," Eva said, smiling. She held up her phone. "Your performance is all over social media. People are calling it a turning point for the community." Malachi raised an eyebrow. "A turning point, huh?" "All I did was play some music." Eva crossed the room and set the phone in front of him. The screen read, "A symphony of forgiveness, how one man's music brought a city together." "You didn't just play music," Eva said softly. "You told your story. And you gave people like Richard a chance to change." Malachi sipped his tea, letting her words sink in. "Maybe. Or maybe they'll forget by next week." Eva shook her head. "Not this time. This time, it's different." Richard sat at his desk, staring at a stack of paperwork. The usual hum of office life buzzed around him, but his focus was elsewhere. The performance lingered in his mind, the music, the words, the sense of shared humanity. His assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Hale? There's someone here to see you." "Who is it?" Richard asked, rubbing his temples. Claire, his assistant said. Richard sighed but nodded. Send her in. Claire entered, her expression wary but determined. Well, you've been busy, she said, sitting across from him. Richard leaned back in his chair. What do you want, Claire? I wanted to see if last night actually meant something to you, she said bluntly. Or if it was just another performance for you to clap politely at and forget about. Richard frowned. It meant something. Then prove it, Claire said, her tone sharp. You've spent years hiding behind your grief and anger. Do something real with it for once. Her words stung, but Richard nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that. I want to start a fund in James's name to support initiatives for criminal justice reform. Claire's expression softened. That's a good start. It's not enough, Richard admitted. But it's something. And I owe it to him to make things right. The community center buzzed with energy as people gathered for the premiere of Eva's documentary. A projector cast the opening frame onto a large screen, Shadows of Perception, a story of resilience and forgiveness. Malachi sat in the front row, his violin case resting beside him. Eva stood at the front, addressing the audience. This project started as a simple story about a subway performance, she began. But it became so much more, a story about prejudice, resilience, and the power of forgiveness. As the documentary played, the room fell silent. It showcased Malachi's journey, his relationship with his father, and the tension with Richard. The footage of the performance brought tears to many eyes, the music resonating even through the screen. When the lights came back on, the audience erupted in applause. Eva approached Malachi, who stood to address the crowd. I never thought my music could lead to something like this, he said, his voice steady. But if it's taught me anything, it's that our stories matter. And that sharing them, through music, words, or actions, can change the world, one note at a time. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving the courtyard quieter. Richard lingered near the entrance, watching Malachi as he packed his violin. Finally, he approached. You did good tonight, Richard said. Malachi turned toward him, a faint smile on his face. Thanks. So did you? Richard looked confused. Me? You showed up, Malachi said simply. That's more than most people would have done. Richard chuckled dryly. High praise. Malachi leaned on his cane, his expression thoughtful. Look, I don't know what's next for you. But if you're serious about change, you'll find a way to make it happen. I am, Richard said. And I want to start by working with you. Malachi raised an eyebrow. Working with me? Richard nodded. Your story, your music, it's powerful. I think we could use it to raise awareness, to support reform. Maybe we could even heal some of the divides in this city. Malachi was silent for a moment, then extended a hand. All right. Let's see what we can do. It was quiet in the subway station, the usual chaos muted by the late hour. Malachi stood at his usual spot, his violin poised. Eva and Richard stood nearby, watching as he began to play. The notes filled the air, rich and full, carrying a new sense of purpose. Commuters paused, drawn by the music. Some recognized him from the performance, others simply stopped to listen. Richard turned to Eva. This is where it all started, isn't it? She nodded. And look how far it's come. Richard watched the small crowd gather around Malachi, their faces lit with admiration. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope. As Malachi finished the piece, the crowd erupted into applause. He smiled, his unseeing eyes turned toward the sound. You were right, Dad, he murmured to himself. Music really can change the world.